The next stage is to sharpen edges, and that means clarify the premises and break them up, where doing so would help understand what they're really claiming. So let's look first at the BLM's argument, which simply says Conoco has a lease, these lands were set aside subject to valid rights, therefore its hands are tied. We got to clarify, first of all, the conclusion, its hands are tied. What does that mean? Well, basically, the BLM is claiming, I can't do anything about Conoco. You know, my hands are tied. Don't hold me responsible. There's nothing I can do. Okay? They're offering an excuse. Next, premise 2. These lands were set aside subject to valid existing rights. Well, what does set aside mean? It means that you're not allowed to drill there. But subject to valid existing rights means that you are allowed to drill there if you've got a valid existing right. So this premise can be restated as saying that if Conoco does have a valid existing right to drill, then the BLM must allow Conoco to drill. Okay, what about breaking up premises? What about premise 1? Well, that's one that I think we're going to have to break up, because it says that Conoco has a lease that gives it the right to drill. And gives it, we already marked as an argument marker, which suggests that the fact that Conoco has a lease is supposed to be a reason why it has a right to drill. So there's an argument implicit in that one sentence. And that means that we can take this whole argument and restate it something like this. Conoco has a lease, therefore Conoco has a valid right to drill. If Conoco has a valid right to drill, then the BLM must allow Conoco to drill. Therefore, the BLM must allow Conoco to drill. That is supposed to be the central force of the explicit premises and conclusions in the first part, where the BLM gives its argument. The next part is Redford's response to this argument. Let's start with Redford's conclusion. What's he trying to show? He's trying to show the opposite of the BLM's argument. They're trying to show that their hands are tied, that is, that they can't stop Conoco from drilling. So Redford wants to show that they can stop Conoco from drilling, or even that they must stop Conoco from drilling. So that's the conclusion he's trying to reach. What he says is, sounds like Washington double-speak to me. Well, that's because he's saying that people in Washington always say their hands are tied and can't get anything done. And he's going to argue that their hands aren't tied because they can and must stop Conoco from drilling. So we can replace the conclusion simply with the claim that the BLM must stop Conoco from drilling. Now we know how the argument ends, so let's take those premises and conclusion and number them pretty high so that we can leave some room for the other premises that come before them. The next thing we need to do is to get an argument for that central premise, Conoco does not have any valid right to drill. Now, here's what Redford said, that the leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input, and in deciding to issue a permit now, the BLM didn't conduct a full analysis. Notice that there are two parts to these claims. One is about the leases, and the other is about the permit. Because in order to have a valid right to drill, Conoco needs to have a lease and a permit. Redford argues that there are problems with both the lease and the permit, but the considerations are a little different, so we need to separate those two parts into different arguments. The first part of his argument concerns the leases. He says that the leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input, therefore none of the leases conveyed a valid right to drill. Then the second part has to do with the permit. In deciding to issue a permit to drill now, the BLM did not conduct a full analysis, therefore none of the permits conveyed a valid right to drill. And the idea of the argument is going to be that the leases don't give them a right and the permits don't give them a right, so they ain't got no right. Wow. But that premise in the argument to show that the permit's not valid is a long premise with lots of different parts, so we need to break it up. And we can figure out how to break it up by looking at the argument markers in the part of the passage that in effect constitute that premise. we know that there's a premise marker at the beginning, once more, a discounting term, but, on the basis of is an argument marker, even is a discounting term. And that breaks that long premise into parts. So we can break them into A, the BLM did not conduct a full analysis of the environmental impacts of drilling on these incomparable lands. No full analysis. B, the BLM determined that there would be no significant environmental harm. Okay. C, the BLM conducted only an abbreviated review of the environmental harm. And D, the BLM didn't even look at drilling on other federal leases. What about B? The BLM determined there'd be no significant environmental impact. Well, that's what Redford opposes, so that's not going to be part of his argument. How do the other three claims fit together? Which is a reason for which? Well, now we're into a different step, namely organize the parts. And it's not completely clear, but it seems like Redford has two separate complaints. One is that the BLM did not look sufficiently hard at the environmental impact at this particular site, the Capirowitz Plateau. The other complaint is that they didn't do a comparative analysis and look at other leases on other federal lands to see, what happens when drilling was allowed there and when permits were issued in those other circumstances. So one claim is about this particular site, and the other claim is a lack of comparison to other sites. These 2 points become even clearer in the next paragraph, if you remember that. There he said, first, I've spent considerable time in these extraordinary lands for years, and I know that an oil rig in their midst would have a major impact. So there he's talking about the impact on this particular site, on these particular lands. But right after that he says, what's more, indicating it's a separate argument, what's more, Conoco wants to drill a well to find oil. Inevitably, more rigs, more roads, new pipelines, toxic waste, and bright lights would follow to get the oil out. There he seems to be suggesting if you just looked over at the other leases, you'd find that when you allow oil drilling, a lot more happens than you ever expected to begin with. I'm, of course, not agreeing with this. It might be true or it might not. My point is that this is the structure of Redford's own claims that make up his own argument. So there are two separate ways in which the review failed to be full. The first is that the BLM conducted only an abbreviated review, in the sense that they didn't look carefully at this particular site itself. And the second is that the BLM didn't look at drilling at other places. Therefore, the conclusion is the BLM did not conduct a full analysis. That seems to be what Redford's saying in this particular sentence. Now let's bring it all together and clean it up a little bit in the process. 1, all of Conoco's leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input. That's supposed to support. 2, none of Conoco's leases give it a valid right to drill. Then 3, the BLM conducted an abbreviated review. They didn't look as carefully as they should have at the lands. 4, the BLM didn't look at drilling on lands under the other federal leases, the comparative claim. And those 2 are supposed to support. 5, the BLM did not conduct a full analysis. And what that's supposed to show is that 6, its permit does not give Conoco a valid right to drill. Therefore, 7, which is supposed to follow from 2 and 6, Conoco does not have a valid right to drill. 8, if Conoco does not have a valid right to drill, then the BLM must not allow Conoco to drill. Therefore, the BLM must not allow Conoco to drill. Make sense? Seem fair? I hope so. I think it's a pretty good reconstruction of what Redford had in mind.